Dr. Micha Jackson has been engaged in wildlife research and monitoring Australia and overseas for more than 15 years. Her career began in Northern Australia, where she provided support for land and sea management activities to Indigenous ranger programs in coastal communities. So her PhD, which she completed at the University of Queensland, was aimed at improving migratory shorebird habitat conservation in highly developed coastal regions of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. So Micha currently works at the CSIRO, and she joined that organisation in 2023 and currently works on waterbird tracking to support improved water management in the Murray Darling Basin. So she's also a member of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway Partnership Shorebird Working Group core team, and she also was the past president of the Society for Conservation Biology Oceania.
From the tundra, what shorebirds get up to on the breeding grounds? I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I'm joining from today, which is the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra. But I also want to acknowledge the Inupiaq people of Utqiagvik in Alaska, which is the town where I was based during all of the things I'm going to talk about here. So just to orient you with the town a little bit. Utqiagvik is one of the northernmost inhabited towns anywhere in the world. You can see the star from where we are and where they are couldn't possibly be much further apart, especially when you put a flat global map down. You can see a photo of the town there. It's really amazing. It's obviously right on the water, right on the coast. And a fun fact for the night is that only 2.6% of the Earth's surface lies as far or further north from the equator than Utqiagvik. So I traveled up to Utqiagvik in 2023, and I spent, I think, about 10 weeks there. And I was giving a hand to some amazing researchers who have been looking at shorebirds up on the Arctic breeding ground for more than 20 years now. So I want to start off by acknowledging them. Many of you, I'm sure, have come across Rick Langto either by name or in person along the way. Rick is absolutely amazing. He's with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and he has been running this program out of Utqiagvik for more than 20 years. So, you know, a huge amount of what we know about shorebirds up on the breeding grounds is in part or in whole thanks to Rick. And the others are photos of the team that was there specifically for the same summer that I was there. Had a great time with all these lovely people. So just want to acknowledge them to start off with and thank them very much for having me. I was a bit of a risk and an outsider to invite up to a very intense situation. So yeah, I just really appreciate them taking a chance on me and giving me the opportunity. Okay, so we all know we're in the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, and we've all seen this map, I'm sure, many, many times. But what I sometimes forget is that the top of our flyway is connected directly to another flyway, and that's the Pacific Flyway that goes down that west coast of North America. So we have this amazing space, particularly in Alaska, where some of the birds from our parts of the world, some of the birds from New Zealand, some of the birds from East Asia, and then some of the birds from the west coast of North America all mingle together up on the breeding grounds. So that's kind of the context of this. So just to kind of think about, well, to sort of set the scene, I guess when I went up to the breeding grounds, my whole kind of worldview of shorebirds was shaped by what they do on the non-breeding grounds. And I'm sure many, many of you, probably all of you, are very familiar with movement patterns like this one. So I love this animation. I probably use it too much, but I really love it. So imagine each of these little balls of light is a shorebird. And, you know, I always think of shorebirds as these amazing creatures whose lives are dominated by the movements of the tide. They spread out onto the mudflats when the tide goes down, and then they group together in these bunches, you know, in the nearshore high tide roosting areas at high tide. And so that's kind of how I think of the daily movements and rhythms of shorebirds. And then, of course, we know that they do this big migration. So in our part of the world, on the non-breeding grounds, you know, this is the key habitat for our coastal shorebirds, right? These mudflats. This is a photo of tidal mudflats in the Yellow Sea near the Towsini area. That was where I did my fieldwork for my PhD. That's like the most important area for spoon-billed sandpipers anywhere in the flyway, but also lots of our birds obviously travel up to that area as well. And we know how important these habitats are for birds. We know that in the mud, you know, you have this rich, amazing food source, all of it's seafood, you know, bivalves, crabs, polychaetes, all the rest of it. And I think a lot of us are very familiar with the types of threats that the birds face in these habitats, particularly coastal development, as far as the tidal flat habitat is concerned. And then, of course, at high tide, we think of shorebirds gathering together in these really dense flocks. So one of these is a photo from Moreton Bay and another one from Broome. But, you know, we have these amazing high tide roost sites all through the country, including where you all are. And, you know, we're familiar with the types of threats that shorebirds face there, particularly disturbance, dogs running through the flocks, maybe housing developments impacting some of these super tidal habitats and so on. So that was kind of my vision of shorebirds, because everywhere that I had interacted with them was obviously on the non-breeding grounds or during the migration through the Yellow Sea. But I kind of knew, and I would say, oh yeah, there's this other part where they breed, and then they come back and spend most of their time in the non-breeding grounds. And I talk a lot about, you know, migrating through the Yellow Sea and all the rest of it. But so that's kind of the blue bit and the yellow bit on here that we're really familiar with. But then there's this red bit, you know, the bit up the top. What on earth do these birds get up to when they get up there? You know, you can kind of read about it and talk to people about it, but I felt like I needed to go and see it to really kind of understand the whole, you know, annual life that these birds I spend so much time with kind of do. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about tonight, is this, you know, individually, every single year, all of these amazing tiny little shorebirds are one bird, but they sort of have two different lives. And that's kind of how I've just structured this. It's a very non-scientific talk. It's much more about my sort of impression of the birds and how their life changes when they're up in the Arctic based on the sort of 2+ months that I spent up there with them. So I guess the first thing that really struck me was this, you know, change from flocks to pairs. So obviously, you know, on the tidal flats, the birds are spread out a bit, but they do every day, you know, once or twice a day, form these really dense flocks. And so on the non-breeding grounds, I think of shorebirds as being, you know, quite gregarious and in big groups. But on the tundra, it's such a vast area that these birds go up to, largely quite featureless. You know, unlike high tide roosts, you know, you can kind of think in the well-known shorebird areas in Australia, high tide roost sites have very specific features. And, you know, if those features are there, you're going to see lots of shorebirds if there's a productive mudflat nearby. But the tundra is kind of much more uniform. It's just this huge space, and birds just spread out, and they're pretty much seen in ones and twos. Like, they don't really get together. So maybe in the first couple of weeks when they arrive, and maybe in the time right before they leave again, they start, you know, moving back to the non-breeding behavior and forming little feeding flocks and things. But by and large, they're obviously spread out at very low densities across the tundra. So that really, yeah, I guess struck me as something that's really different between these two parts of their lives. And then, of course, we have the plumage. So this is well, of course, even the name of this is of course totally suggestive, right? Like, we call this bird a grey phalarope, same as we call our plovers grey plovers. But on folks who live up north, they call them by the names that they see them in, which is like this. So same bird. This was one of the most common birds in the area that we were working in, Alaska. So we go from a grey phalarope to a red phalarope, and we can't even agree with the people who live near the breeding grounds on what the name of this bird is, which makes sense because, you know, they do have these sort of dazzling transformations from, you know, quite you know, nondescript, very grey-brown birds to some of them really having these very striking plumages up there. So yeah, it's really lovely up on the breeding grounds that, you know, sort of every bird you see is in this sort of dazzling plumage. Most of them, you know, obviously incorporating those beautiful sort of burnt oranges and reds. Did anyone see the phalaropes when they turned up in Darwin that year? No, a few folks flipped. It was kind of crazy. So at the Liania sewage ponds up in Darwin, which used to be a wonderful place to see shorebirds until they cut it off for bird watchers, we had a grey phalarope turn up, and then a small flock of the other phalaropes turned up within a couple of days, and people went crazy, and all sorts of people flocked to see them. It was great. Anyway, so yes, obviously this huge transformation in what the birds look like. Some other examples. This is a dunlin from where I was doing my PhD fieldwork in China. So probably one of the more drab of all the drab shorebirds. They're also just spectacular up in the tundra, really beautiful, just really, really intricate feathers, just stunning, and a bit of a cap as well. So yeah, just huge change. And then I guess the next thing is, it's just amazing that these birds make such a dramatic habitat switch. Like, I just associate shorebirds so much with the ocean and with mudflats, but they really become grassland birds when they go up to the tundra. And you see these same birds that you would normally see on the mud amongst these beautiful, like delicate tundra flowers. And they look, they remind me of birds that you normally see on the prairies. And in fact, some of the birds that breed with them, I'll talk a bit about some of the other species later, are very much grassland birds. So yeah, it's just amazing that they can make this huge habitat switch. And something that sort of struck me in Utqiagvik is, as you saw from the photo of the town's right on the ocean, but the ocean's actually frozen most of the time, and only kind of breaks up for small periods. But even when the ice clears and stuff, the birds don't go anywhere near the beach. They couldn't, nothing to do with the ocean. Like, it's not a very far distance to where the tundra starts, but they spend all of their time there in the grass. Even like in the town, there's a little cemetery just really close to the ocean, and lots of birds actually breed inside the cemetery. Nah, couldn't be bothered visiting the beach, don't go to the ocean for any reason. So yeah, it's just a really dramatic transformation. The other thing that I really didn't sink in for me until I learned more about these birds being up there is just how diverse their breeding strategies are. So I think, their behavior is largely similar in many ways, especially for coastal shorebirds in the non-breeding areas, but their breeding strategies are really different between species. So you have the real sort of monogamous that are very faithful, sometimes even have the same mate one year to another, and they do very cooperative parenting. So firstly, on the left, you've got dunlins, on the right, that's a Western sandpiper. But you've got the pairs do very kind of equal sharing of the nest responsibilities. They'll team up to try and distract predators and move them off. They'll share incubation duties, sometimes share feeding with one another, and so on. So it's that very highly monogamous, just one pair, one plot. They defend it together. They defend the eggs together, and so on. But then there are some much more unconventional parenting arrangements, let's say. So if you were to think of a typical bird, including shorebirds, do you imagine that this one here on the left would be the male or the female? I can't really hear you, but I'm going to assume someone said male, right? We normally have the males have the brighter colors, and this, you can see this sort of much duller bird on the right. But actually with phalaropes, it's the reverse. So this is the female and this is the male, and the behaviors are actually reversed as well. So it's really amazing. The females come up for a very short time. They kind of plop their eggs on the tundra. I actually had a phalarope lay an egg on my foot. She was like, I'm ready to go. You're standing right near my nest, which I didn't see because she had only just made a tiny scrape, and she was like, nuts, it's happening here. And the females pretty much just drop the eggs and head off, and they leave the males to do the entirety of the parenting duty. I would say of all the shorebirds, the phalaropes are kind of the most well, they're actually the easiest to find their nests because the males are so hesitant to leave the nests. So you can, especially later in the breeding season, you can literally like reach down and pick up the males off the nest. Like, they will not leave those eggs. Whereas lots of the other shorebirds, their strategy is, they'll see you a mile off, it's a flat tundra, and they'll just, they'll kind of sneak off into the grass. And, if you eat the eggs, you eat the eggs. They're not going to risk too much over it, and they'll hope that you don't find them. Whereas the phalaropes, which are all male, after a couple of weeks, are extremely, extremally stuck to the nest. So yeah, it's really amazing. And I thought I would share this awesome video. I'm sure you can tell this is the other species, redneck phalarope, and so red phalarope. But all the male phalaropes do this sort of duty after, well, you'll see what happens. This was actually filmed. I was sitting in the kitchen sink of our accommodation and filming out the window. I was so excited to see this. There's Dad just standing there looking, oh, one 2, 3, 4 fit under there. So as with most shorebird chicks, phalaropes are the same, where the chicks can feed each other straight away, but they can't stay warm. So they'll kind of burst out from under dad's wings, go have a bit of a forage, and then gather back under dad's wings. And while he's standing there, you literally can't even see the 4 fluff balls underneath. So that's pretty special. So still talking about diverse breeding strategies. So we've talked about monogamous birds. We've talked about kind of reverse role compared to normal. Well, not, I shouldn't say normal, compared to the norm amongst most species. Then you have pectoral sandpipers, which have a completely different strategy. Again, male pectoral sandpipers literally. Oh, can you hear that? That's one of the male pectoral sandpiper calls. So the male pectoral sandpipers each only stay on the tundra for a few days, and then they actually fly around to all different breeding grounds trying to mate with as many females as possible. They travel thousands of extra kilometers on top of their migration in order to rove the tundra for these several months of the breeding season. They might visit more than 20 potential breeding sites. Some amazing work that's been done. I think I put his name up. Yeah, check out the work of Dr. Bart if you ever get a chance. He's done amazing work where he's done like implants into the brains of pectoral sandpipers and things, and looked at their sleep patterns and found that they drastically reduce their sleep during this period so that they can make the most of their time up on the breeding ground. They have that booming call. So like when you're out in amongst the nesting plots, you just have these kind of swooping male pectoral sandpipers booming their calls all over the tundra. We jokingly call this area on the chests their chesticles, because that's where they're pumping up full of air to make those booming calls. So they're, yeah, absolutely the pests of the tundra. They drive all the other birds, and most of the research is crazy. Totally different strategy, again, from those birds. So that's kind of a bit about their different breeding strategies. The other thing I just wanted to mention that I found so interesting was just this is kind of something that has a similarity, I suppose, to some degree between their breeding and non-breeding grounds. I think a lot of us are familiar with how site faithful shorebirds can be. That's how you see your flagged birds in your same roosting sites year after year, because they're always coming back to their favorite same spots. Not all of the birds, but some of the birds, and Dunlin in particular, do a similar thing on the breeding ground. So some of the researchers up there, usually like at the end of the season, they put like a nail in where the nest is that has a number on it, so they know where the nests were. And sometimes these males, you know, they have the entirety of tens of thousands of square kilometers of tundra. They've just flown 15,000 kilometers to get there, and they'll nest within 50 meters of the nest the year before. How they even can tell the feature of that area compared to the entire rest of the tundra that looks exactly the same, I've got no idea. But it's really amazing examples of extreme site fidelity on the nesting grounds that kind of mirrors that aspect of their lives on the non-breeding grounds. The other thing I just wanted to highlight was the not so impressive nests that these birds make. So compared to some other Arctic species, that's a nice little nest, right? It's actually quite deep in the ground. You can see it's got some nice, lovely feathers around it to keep the eggs nice and warm. That's the nest of this guy. Anyone know what that bird is? Lapland longspur. So that's one of those kind of sparrow-like, very sort of grasslandy type birds. That is one of the other birds that breeds right in amongst the shorebirds. So you might be equally likely to find a longspur nest as a shorebird nest. So it's quite a nice nest, I think. Again, this one's like quite a big nest. It is built up a little bit. It's got nice down feathers in there. That's the nest of a greater white-fronted goose. So remember, the tundra is, you know, so flat. So you don't have a lot to work with. But, you know, I think these are examples of birds that have made some effort. By contrast, this 3 eggs dropped on a rock without much anything else around it. That's from an American golden plover, obviously very similar to our Pacific golden plover. So I'd say across the board, the shorebirds we call their nests scrapes, and that is a good character, like rather than nest. And I think that's a good characterization. It seems to be a couple little digs, and yeah, that's good enough. So most of the nests are pretty minimal. So I thought that was really interesting. I think also just highlighting how absolutely stunningly beautiful the shorebird eggs are, even amongst the same species. Like Dunlin, as an example, their eggs have this beautiful kind of blue hue to them, but you know, it's quite variable between nests, what the eggs look like, what shape they are, what size they are, etc. So yeah, it's an amazing aspect as well. So yeah, I guess I talked a little bit, you know, very briefly about some of the threats we're familiar with on the non-breeding grounds. On the breeding grounds, you know, absolutely the primary threat, aside from climate change, which I'll talk about a bit later, is, you know, from nest predation. So we've got this Arctic fox. I actually ended up having to throw something at this fox. It came so close to me. It just had absolutely no fear whatsoever. But foxes are a big predator. Anyone know what kind of bird this is? So that's one of the Jaeger species. So there's 3 species of Jaegers that also nest up there. This one's a long-tailed Jaeger, which actually doesn't predate shorebird eggs very much, but the other 2 species, particularly parasitic Jaeger and, well, Pomeranian Jaeger to a degree as well, will take shorebird eggs, certainly. And then this is probably one of the worst offenders as far as shorebird egg predation goes, the glaucous gulls. So the glaucous gulls also breed up there. If you get near their nest, they're fiercely aggressive, and they also do snag quite a few shorebird eggs. But the foxes are a really big one. I think they can sniff out the eggs pretty easily. And what I learned by being up there is that the predation rates of nests are extremely high. Lots of birds have a couple of goes over the breeding season, but on the whole, nesting success is quite low, mostly due to egg predation. Also just wanted to make some remarks that fieldwork's a little different up there. This is genuinely a field site behind me. There's absolutely no way to tell where the tundra ends and the sky begins. I was pretty much completely lost within 5 minutes. If we didn't have our little stakes on the ground, there's no way I would ever get back to civilization ever again. So when you arrive on the breeding grounds, yeah, to start research work, it's still pretty snowy. These were the ADVs that we used to get to our sites every day. And yep, some mornings the first duty was clearing them of snow. Later in the season, the biggest issue was that snow buntings absolutely love to breed in the exhaust pipes of the ADVs. So you had to be constantly careful that you didn't have a snow bunting in your exhaust pipe when you started. And even literally over the course of a day, doing work on the plots, you might come back to your ATV and find that a snow bunting has tried to start nesting there. So that was not a problem we usually have to contend with here. Also, just to kind of give you an example of how like the day-to-day life of a shorebird researcher is different. Those of you who know me know I've spent a lot of time in Darwin. A typical shorebird research day in Darwin, you know, you go to Lee Point, that's the big roosting site in Darwin. You go with a few mates for 2 hours. Ideally, you're wearing thongs, you're on the beach, it's warm out. You might count 8,000 to 10,000 shorebirds. You might find, you know, 14 different leg flags from 4 different countries. So you've now seen thousands of birds. You've written all sorts of things in your notebook, and then you've been on the beach with your mates, and you go have a coffee and catch up with everyone else, and that's kind of your morning of shorebird work. In Utkarvik, our days were a bit like this. You spend the entire day completely alone. So you take your ATV out and you don't see anyone else, alive human, sometimes not alive anything, for another 10 or 11 hours. You are wearing hip boots the entire time, which chafe on absolutely everything. At the beginning of the breeding season, there's still snow. And so every time you step on the snow, you post hole, meaning your feet fall through and then you're hip deep in snow and you have to get that leg out in order to take the next step, which is tiring after about 5 minutes, let alone after about 10 hours. At the end of the breeding season, you have the opposite problem. All the snow is melted, but the tundra is very wet. So then you sink into the mud of the tundra every other step and have the same problem. And so you have giant hip flexes by the end of the summer. And after all that work of 10 hours on your own, and extreme workout, you might have found 3 or 4 nests if you're lucky. And you put a little flag next to them. Can you see the nest there next to that blue flag? That's a phalarope nest. So yes, the fieldwork is very, very intense. Kind of like everything in the Arctic, it's compressed, right? Like everything has to happen in this magical, sort of 8 to 10 weeks when you can go outside and it's habitable. And you have, I didn't mention before too, it's 24 hours of daylight. So absolutely pretty much no change in the ambient light for the entire couple of months, which is, yeah, quite interesting for the body, but also means you can put in very, very long work days because there's no excuse for not working at any time of day. Yeah, so it's quite interesting, challenging, amazing doing field work up there. So I just wanted to end with, just a couple of reflections of what that means for sort of life for people in the Arctic. Like I said, that 24 hours of daylight means that, all the whole year is regulated by, that extreme difference between summer and winter. And people just stay up all hours. The grocery stores open till midnight in the summer because that's kind of when everything gets done. This is a picture looking out towards the ocean. So you can see it's frozen all the way in. That was an incredible thing for me, just like flying in and just seeing the entire ocean being frozen. That's just amazing. We all were required to do a polar plunge. So I have officially swum in the Arctic Ocean. That is ice out beyond me. The sea temperature was several degrees below zero. That was chilly, but that's something that everyone who visits up there must do. It's very good for your circulation, heart rate. The other thing that's really obvious up there is that, people's lives are still very much in tune with and, driven by what's going on in the landscape and the wildlife. So, for example, bowhead whale hunting is a huge part of life. That arc there is kind of the famous symbol of Utqiagvik, the town. It's an arc made out of whale bones. You often see people have like jackets that look like sports jackets around town, but it's actually all like the whaling team that they're a part of. So yeah, very much still life is driven by, the resources of the landscape and of course the season and the fact that you have this, amazing plenty for a very short period of time and then the rest of the year sort of cold and parts of it very, very dark. So yeah, it's an amazing way to live. Yeah. Of course, I just wanted to mention some other inhabitants, really just showing off a little bit, but there are amazing other species there besides shorebirds. So you have 3 species of eiders, which are spectacular ducks. We had snowy owls out. Often that would be like the bird that would actually hang out with you during the day. You'd have a snowy owl for a couple of hours, wondering what on earth you were doing. Loon, Pacific loon, amazing species. Ptarmigan, I was so excited to see. I've waited my whole life to see ptarmigan. Finally got to see one up there in full breeding plumage. So yeah, some pretty amazing other bird species to enjoy while you're up there. And then the real star of the show is the polar bears. So polar bears do come right into town there. We were lucky enough to see 6 or 7 through the season that I was there. Yeah, just absolutely amazing. They mostly stay out on the ice. But people sometimes put out whale meat for them and they will come quite close into town. You have to be very careful. But yeah, just spectacularly special to see these things in the wild. For me, it was a bit like, seeing a myth come to life. So that was amazing. And then the other amazing thing that happened was the first time I ever gave this talk was actually at the very first ever Darwin Shorebird Festival. And it was awesome to see when I was up there that the very first Utqiagvik Shorebird Festival happened while we were there. So we all gave a hand and had awesome participation from the community. And it's now become an annual thing. So that's the awesome logo from 2024. And I just saw the program came out for this year's Shorebird Festival. So yeah, I think it's a thing that's taking off all over the world. Everywhere that shorebirds travel, there's now community shorebird festivals, and that's just, really heartwarming and lovely to see. Very last, I just wanted to touch a little bit on some of the amazing research coming out of the Arctic, just because some of the topics might not be something you think of necessarily with shorebirds, because again, we mostly hear about the research from the non-breeding grounds. So one of the things, this is a very, very complicated title, but it's really talking about the issues arising from climate change to do with timing of the food, right? So shorebirds timing when they turn up in the Arctic is very closely linked to when arthropods and other insects are hatching. And so there's a lot of research going on looking at whether climate change is potentially creating a mismatch and whether shorebirds are adjusting their timing appropriately and how that all works. So that's quite an interesting one. I think one of the findings in this paper that was quite interesting was that potentially that warming for some species is actually making food more plentiful. So it might, there's obviously lots of implications of the changing climate, but potentially for some species, the food side of the equation actually gets a bit easier. Sort of similarly, this is around looking at the timing of whether birds are changing their timing, how they're changing their timing, how that works across species. And then I was just going to highlight the other amazing thing about the Arctic is sometimes you get to count shorebirds by helicopter. So all the findings from this study pretty much, and some of the team members that I was working with in Utqiagvik, some of their work was going out on a helicopter, getting dropped in the middle of the tundra for days at a time, and good luck surviving until someone picks you up. So yeah, that's sort of another amazing aspect of the research up there. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to share. I hope that was interesting, little detour. I know most of these species are not exactly the same species that we have down here, but they do mingle with our species in the Yellow Sea and East Asia. And I think, a lot of our birds would get up to similar things on their particular parts of the breeding ground. So thank you so much for having me. And I do apologize again that I wasn't able to come in person. I really wanted to, but hopefully I'll get down later in the year, come to one of the other talks.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Micha.